I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS, where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm Evan Brown, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys. Thanks for listening to The Trade Guys. On today's episode, we bring in Dr. Phil Luck to talk about some contentious tariffs on Brazil and India, and then we'll discuss the impacts of recent U.S. trade policy on China and Russia. All this and more on The Trade Guys. Hello, and welcome back to The Trade Guys. Trade Guy Scott is off enjoying the sunshine with his grandson, so we are here with Bill Reinsch as always, and Dr. Phil Luck. We're coming to you on the afternoon of August 7th. And we're, of course, very happy to have Phil filling in for Scott. So let's dive right in. I want to turn first to the sunny nation of Brazil, which has found itself as a recent target of 50% tariffs from the Trump administration. This is yet another seemingly novel application of tariffs from Tariff Man. So we're really focused here on the investigation of former President Bolsonaro, it seems. And I have to give Bill credit. He's been saying that Trump only has one tool, and that's tariffs, of course, for quite a long time now. So, Bill, will this tool work this time?
Well, it's hard to see how it will. This is actually worrisome. I'm kind of more worried about this one than I am about a bunch of the others because it's so overtly political and not related either to economics or even related, I think, to the statute. How you can argue that litigation that's going on in Brazil, subject to Brazilian law and the Brazilian judicial system, constitutes a national emergency for the United States seems to me to be a real stretch. And I think the administration implicitly acknowledged that when they immediately, at the same time he announced the tariff, immediately directed the U.S. Trade Representative to initiate a Section 301 investigation into Brazil's unfair trade practices. That is, I think, pretty obviously kind of the backup plan in case he loses on the IEEPA issue. And frankly, if I were a plaintiff in the IEEPA litigation, I would make the Brazilian case, the first paragraph in my brief, because it's very hard to argue that this constitutes an emergency and that it's a legitimate inbounds, if you will, use of delegated congressional authority. And I think they anticipate losing on that one. So the 301 is backup. And in fairness, legally, it's a better backup. If the USTR does find unfair trade practices, and the reality is you can find them with almost everybody if you dig hard enough, even though we have a trade surplus with Brazil, you can still find things to complain about. That would justify a trade action on the part of the president. What he probably doesn't know and may get tripped up by in the future is that the Section 301 decisions are technically a decision by the U.S. Trade Representative and not by the president. Unlike Section 232 cases, the reality is the USTR will do what the president tells him to do, but statutorily, it's the USTR that makes the decision. That's important because it means that the 301 process is subject to the Administrative Procedures Act. And that means there's a whole bunch of bells and whistles that the agency has to go through as it conducts its investigation. It has to solicit comments. It has to have consultations, all these different things. And the record of the Trump administration historically has been that when they end up in litigation, they often lose on process foul grounds. In other words, the court doesn't get to the merits of what the president has done. They end up deciding that he didn't do it the right way. He didn't follow the bells and whistles. He didn't pay any attention to the speed bumps that are written into these laws. So you may find that happening in the Brazilian case if this investigation goes through to its conclusion. It also raises the question, and this is what really concerns me, of what is there to negotiate? He slapped the tariffs on, and the Brazilian response was basically, this is a violation of our sovereignty, which it is. And so what are they supposed to respond with? With tariffs, you can offer to invest, you can offer to make various deals, you can negotiate over the amount of the tariff. But when it's a fundamental sovereignty issue and sort of the independence of your country, there's not a lot to negotiate about. I think in addition, what we're going to see on this one, in a way, Lula is President Lula, I should say, is kind of calling Trump's bluff in a way. And he's better positioned to do that. First of all, I think recognizing that the actual tariff has a very long list of exemptions. Aircraft, orange juice, oil, actually, iron ore, Some of our biggest imports from Brazil are actually exempted from the tariff. 700 product lines, tariff lines entirely, have been exempted in this order. And so the people who do the analysis figured out that maybe about 36% of Brazilian exports are actually exposed to the tariff, and 45% are not. That doesn't add up to 100, so I don't know. There's must be some third category there. And the economists, I think in Brazil, are estimating that their GDP growth forecast for this year remains about the same as it has been, which is not great, 1.6 to 1.7%. But it doesn't sound like they're going to take a big hit from this. And the other reason, aside from the exemptions, is that we are not their biggest trading partner. Unlike a lot of countries where we are, Brazil's exports to the US are only 12% of their total exports, and they're less than 2% of their GDP. Their biggest trading partner is China. And what we are doing with all this is driving them closer to China and increasing them to diversify their source of trade away from us, and I think to the long run detriment of the United States. So to me, it's a bad move on economic grounds, but it's a worse move on political grounds because it weaponizes trade. Not the first time we've done it. But the irony is, we're really taking a page from the Chinese book. They perfected it in recent years. Ask the Lithuanians, ask the Norwegians, ask the Koreans, ask the Australians. We're doing the same thing. And we should be embarrassed about it, but I don't think we are.
Phil, I think the word that Bill is implying but hasn't said is coercion. Is that how you see this? And how do you think we get out of this? Or do we get out of this?
Yeah, I mean, if you don't call this economic coercion, I'd love to hear what your definition is. Yeah, that's what this is. This is using economic tools for non-economic political aims, squarely in the definition by my read of this. I mean, basically, I agree with everything Bill said. It's hard to see how you get out of this because, unlike issues around economics, you can't split a dollar down the middle or any other way. This is about judicial issues and it's about sovereignty. And that's a tough thing for any country to want to swallow, giving up any of it. To Bill's point also, we are not the biggest trading partner. Unlike several of these situations, we don't have a sort of really robust defense relationship, which has complicated a lot of these issues with, other partners in the Pacific and in Europe. And to Bill's point also, this is bringing them closer together with other partners that we are trying to get people to de-risk from, like the PRC. It's funny that in the first Trump administration, the trade spat with the PRC made the PRC diversify away from our soybeans and diversify towards Brazil, right? So that was a situation where by whacking somebody else, we were bringing Brazil and China together. Now we're doing the same thing, but by whacking Brazil. So totally agree with that. There was two other things I'd add there. One is Bill made a really excellent point about the exemptions. This allows Trump to sort of, sound especially tough and have a 50% tariff while sort of carving parts of this out that are less costly. I guess on one side, you could say, well, it's not quite as high of tariffs, and that's a good thing. The problem there is these are all really distortionary, and none of these are sort of made in a vacuum. There's some really great research from Davin Shore and co-authors up at Dartmouth looking at the exemptions from the first Trump administration. And I know you will be shocked to hear that they were very highly correlated with political giving. So we are finding opportunities for those who are politically connected, those in industries which have very strong lobbying, to be able to make themselves slightly better off and have others not have that opportunity. So this process is not ideal. And then lastly, back to the coercion point, to Bill's point, yes, countries like the PRC have been doing this for a very long time. When I was serving at the State Department in the last administration, we spent a lot of time working with countries who were facing coercive threats by the PRC. And we're worried about this, and we're worried about this type of behavior. And while often countries were willing to take certain steps to avoid retaliation, and while I think the PRC might have found that to be sort of a short-term win, in conversations with those countries, I never felt like the PRC was winning the long game. They were really losing a lot of trust of partners. So I certainly hope that this administration can see beyond their sort of immediate objectives to sort of the longer-term relationship we have with partners.
There doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence for that, unfortunately. I mean, you're right. I have to say, as a former lobbyist, it's nice to know that lobbying is occasionally effective. I generally found as a lobbyist that I lost more than I won, but that was different administrations too. The other thing about this that ought to be pointed out is it bears directly on something Phil said about the long game versus the short game. This has turned out to be an enormous political gift to Lula. I mean, this is a guy that is up for re-election next year, is sagging in the polls, and he's suddenly become the defender of his country's sovereignty. He's rallying in public opinion polls. Bolsonaro, particularly because his son is apparently lobbying for sanctions for this kind of thing, has been put in a very complicated position because, it looks like he's advocating doing things that make things worse for Brazilians. So politically, you have to sit and wonder, did Trump really think this through? In the short run, sure, you get a media hit. He gets a lot of ink, a lot of clicks or views or whatever we're saying these days. And he creates consternation in the marketplace. But in the long run, he's helping the guy that he would prefer not be there. And he's driving them into the hands of the Chinese. I mean, what he's doing just defeats the whole idea of a thoughtful policy that is looking into the long-term future and not just next week.
Well, speaking of the long game, let's turn to India, which is also now facing a 50% tariff. This started as a 25% tariff on August 1st. President Trump cited India's high tariff barriers, trade practices, and of course, its continued purchase of Russian energy. And that's now been upped to 50% as of yesterday, August 6th. So can India quit Russian oil? And is this even a good tool to have them do that? Maybe, Phil, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, so India is the second largest importer of Russian oil right now after China. And it's certainly true that they're importing quite a bit more Russian oil than they did before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 22. Now, that said, mainly that's because Europe stopped buying it and global markets are global markets and it reshuffled, right? And so they have certainly been buying a lot of oil at a discount and earning some profits from that. Now, the first thing I would say is it would be revisionist history to say we didn't want that to happen. The objective, at least until recently, had been to keep Russian oil on the market, but stop them from earning as much revenue from it and therefore reducing the revenue they get that they can put towards the war. The idea was to not have oil markets spike or prices spike. The administration now seems to be more interested in actually removing it from the market and stopping anybody from importing it. That's going to be difficult to do, but if you can actually get India or even the PRC to even reduce their imports to some degree, that would work. I don't think that's going to be very easy, though. I think, again, this is a situation where both politically and economically, that's a really hard pill to swallow. The other thing I would say is it's unclear to me, and again, you can take them at their word if you want, or you can kind of read the tea leaves, unclear to me how much that would actually solve the problem. I think, to your point, Evan, the extra 25%, in the post from the president, we had this like commingling of high tariff barriers, not a good partner, and also Russian oil. And so I'm not convinced that if they solved some of the trade negotiation issues, the Russian oil issue maybe wouldn't be at the top of the pile. The other thing I would say is from a sort of market efficiency standpoint, if we could find a way, again, to get the revenue down without having the oil off the market, that would be better for global markets because not only for the US, but for others, right? So, I mean, if oil prices spike because we somehow actually are successful getting this oil off the market, that's going to be really bad for developing countries, right? Developing countries who are going to have to import at higher prices. It's going to affect food prices, it's going to affect fertilizer prices. So that's going to have sort of spillover effects. The last thing I would say is if the only objective here was harming Russia and getting that oil off the market, there are easier ways to do it than this. There's hundreds of shadow fleet vessels we could sanction tomorrow. There's refineries we could sanction, both in India and in China and other places. So there's other tools here if that was the primary objective.
I think that the point about the ongoing negotiations is an important one. I think that some of this is not just due to Russia, which I'll get to in a minute, but is due to frustration over the inability to close a deal with India. And this has been one of the most up and down agreement that we've been talking about. If you listen to the statements by various U.S. officials at different times, Secretary Lutnick, Secretary Bessent, Kevin Hassett, the number of times this has been on the verge of agreement is probably double digits by now. Every couple of weeks, we're a couple of days away from an Indian agreement. It's going to be a great agreement. According to the president, they're all great agreements. But this one in particular is going to be a great agreement, and we're going to close, and we're there. And the Indians started spreading word that we're going to close. We're there. It's going to be 15%. And then it all falls apart. And I think people that follow India closely were not particularly surprised at that. It's very difficult to reach an agreement with India on anything, actually. But on economics in particular, their whole history is really one of basically economic nationalism. And they are historically less dependent on trade than some other countries. And they have tried to rely on domestic production for most of their needs. They have very, very politically powerful anti-free trade lobbies in the agriculture sector and in the retail sector. to mention just two, that are capable of mobilizing large segments of the population to oppose whichever party comes up with something that they don't like. Dealing with them is never easy. And I think some measure of what's going on here is just presidential frustration that this one isn't coming out the way that he wants it to come out. The Indians, to their credit, are responding with a soft touch. They've not done what Lula did, which is to be defiant, and they're trying to work something out. So maybe they will, but in the short run, it's going to have an impact on their economy, particularly if they get doubly hit with the pharmaceutical 232. Their biggest export to the United States is pharmaceuticals, pharmaceutical products. And if the president comes up with a separate pharma tariff, which he said he's going to do, then the question will be, does that one get added on top of India's 50%, which would basically knock them out of the market if they're not already going to be knocked out? Or is it not assessed separately? Not clear what the answer to that is going to be. It doesn't sound as though the Indians are inclined to change their policy. Their foreign policy, since they became independent, has really been one of more or less non-alignment, and they bend more towards Russia or more to the United States, depending on the needs of the moment. Right now, they're seem to be most worried about China and have been interested in a closer defense relationship with us because of that. Again, this is the same question with Brazil. Did Trump really think through the possible long-term consequences of what he's doing with India? We've spent 20 years since the George W. Bush administration trying to develop a closer relationship with India, economically, diplomatically, and militarily. And that's paid off. If you could look at it over that time period, it's paid off. And now the question is, are we throwing that whole relationship in the trash can over the Russian tariff issues? I don't know the answer. Come back in 3 months and talk about it. Maybe we'll have a better perspective on it.
Yeah, I was amused to see Prime Minister Modi invoking Mahatma Gandhi's rhetoric of Indian self-reliance, talking about a buy Indian movement in response to these tariffs.
That's what they always do. I mean, this is their standard rhetoric, and it's very appealing. It's a nationalist appeal, and it's a big economy. They make lots of stuff. I mean, he's not just spitting into the wind here. They can do some of this. But, at the same time, if they want to continue their fairly impressive growth rate, 6-7% per year of GDP, probably the best way to do that is greater global integration, starting to export more, and that's going to necessitate importing more.
Bill, can I ask you a quick question on that? Which is, it seems to me part of the frustration of this administration, the Trump administration, is specifically around India's unwillingness to lower barriers to U.S. agricultural exports into India. And to your point, there's a really strong Indian agricultural lobby. Agriculture employs hundreds of millions of Indians. And so I'm kind of surprised that's where this administration thought they could make progress. A, I guess, do you think that's right? And B, is that just bad prep work? How did we end up here?
I'm tempted to say they probably fired all the Indian specialists. There was nobody there to point out the obvious history of this. It's a huge sector. I don't remember the percentage of Indians that are engaged that are farmers, basically, that are engaged in the ag community. But you don't have to look very far back historically to remember, I think it was either last year or in 2023 when you had Indian farmers blocking major Indian highways for months over a domestic farm pricing issue. It illustrates the power of the farm. It's not just a lobby, it's rank and file farmers showing up to attack the administration, their administration, for abandoning them. So I think you're right. And I'm surprised that we didn't see that one coming. It's not rocket science. I mean, it's really not rocket science. It's mangoes and soybeans and stuff like that. But we should have noticed that this was going to be harder than we thought.
I want to wrap up by picking up on a thread that Phil brought up a few minutes ago on the Russian shadow fleet. And he said, we could sanction the Russian shadow fleet today. And we're told that actually the administration is considering that as a potential lever as it seeks a deal in Ukraine. This seems to me like one of those things. The question is always, is the tool more valuable in reserve, or should we deploy it? So Phil, what say you there? And why do you think they're keeping it in reserve?
Yeah, I don't know why they're keeping it in reserve. If you're talking about just sanctioning individual vessels, the shadow fleet being this big number of oil tankers that are not attached to Western systems and we don't have a lot of control of them, there's kind of not a lot of cost to sanctioning these, right? So this is not one where I think keeping it in reserve is that useful. In the last administration, there was a pretty constant tempo of sanctioning vessels every once in a while. They have continued to sort of collect information, both the US government, but also the Brits and the Europeans of sanctioning vessels. There's a long list. We could sanction 200 tomorrow, I'm sure. that's not a foolproof solution, right? I mean, this is one of those things where it's whack-a-mole, but it's still helpful to keep whacking the moles. So I would say this is one where we can be disruptive. We can lower the revenue. We can make them buy even more old tankers, right? That's money that can't go towards the war. I think there are bigger things that maybe are helpful to have in reserve. But to be honest, on this point, in terms of things that you would hit Russia specifically with, I think we probably are in a place where there's more carrots in terms of, look, we could delist some pretty major banks if there was actual movement towards a ceasefire or actual movement the way we wanted to get. There's a few more big targets you could hit. But from my perspective, one of the reasons we haven't hit a lot of those is because of the sort of collateral damage. A lot of these big banks that we haven't hit yet, they process a lot of remittances to Central Asian countries, right? So you'd be putting a lot of pain on Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and others. I think there's a lot we can do tomorrow to increase the pressure, but I think that's mostly through increased listings of sanctions, but then also maybe refineries in the PRC and other places as well.
Two things. One of the things that's always confused me about this whole Russia episode is, why has it taken Trump so long to figure out that Putin doesn't want to have a peace agreement? He wants to win. I think this has been obvious to almost everybody for a long time. And he's finally seems to have figured that out. This idea that he's going to end the war in the first day has turned out to be ridiculous. It seems to be finally dawning on him that Putin wants the whole loaf. That's not the way Trump operates. And so why our resident genius took so long to figure that out baffles me. The other thing is there's a lesson here that I have harped on in the distant past, which is one of the things I learned in the export control business is there's always a counter move. No matter what you do, there's always something that the other guys can do. And if you wanted to look at this in a actually kind of amusing historical context, there's a wonderful spy novel by an author named Alan Furst, F-U-R-S-T. This is an unpaid plug here. I'm just a big fan of his literature.
We're not sponsored by them.
We are not sponsored by Alan Furst. And he's written a bunch of books, and they all take place in the late 30s, early 40s, as the war is coming and then the war is on. And they involve spies, and most of them take place on land in France and Germany. But, one of the most interesting ones involves a cargo ship that throughout the novel makes its way around the Mediterranean, stopping at various places, and then up the Atlantic coast, and then into the North Sea, and heads toward ultimately ending up in Latvia, in Riga. And I won't go into the plot, but the interesting thing about it is that every few months they repaint the boat and change the flag, because who the enemy is keeps changing. Because at one point there's a German-Russian peace treaty, and that they're not enemies, and then they are, and then sometimes it's to your advantage to have a Dutch flag, sometimes it's to your advantage to have a German flag, sometimes it's your advantage to have a Brazilian flag. And this particular boat is adept at repainting and reflagging just to respond to politics. And this is what we're going to see now. Yes, you could sanction these ships, and we should, and there seems to be economic evidence that when you do that, it's effective. I agree with Phil. I don't understand why we haven't done it. At the same time, there's going to be a counter move. They will figure out another way to do it. They'll find new ships, they'll reflag the old ones, or they'll figure out some other means of transporting the oil. So it's a constant cat and mouse game, and we simply need to be prepared for that and deal with it.
Couldn't agree more. And yeah, I think it would be better if we had a little bit more of that sort of counter move thinking before we do our first move. The only thing I'll add there, and I'm sure you'll agree, is we basically stopped moving since January 20th, essentially. We just stopped doing things. And that doesn't stop them from making counter moves. They're continuing to make these moves this whole time. So there's been a lot of time we've built up, both on the export control side and on the sanction side, where they've just been able to continue to sort of adjust their behavior.
Well, yes. And, in a different context, this is why we're negotiating transshipment provisions in all these trade deals. And that's not a ship thing or a Russia thing. It's basically the Chinese move around, find a country with a lower tariff, relabel your merchandise and bring it in that way. I mean, going after it is great. The fact that none of these deals define the term or provide much clarity about how to do that is a question we'll take up in another episode. But it's the same thing. The other side doesn't sit still. They don't say, oh, I'm doing something bad, I'm going to stop. They say, I'm doing something that's really profitable, and now I need to find a different way to do it. And we just have to be prepared for that.
Well, as always, we end on a happy note. Thank you very much, Phil, for joining. Thanks, Bill, and we'll see you next week.
You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast. For more audio content, visit csis.org/podcasts. Thanks for tuning in.